Hey everyone, welcome to week 50. It's a pretty cool week for us because it means that by the end of the week, we're going to have done 250 videos for this channel in just a little bit over a year. So that's a pretty good feeling. So yay for all of us. This week, new theme, we're going to paint with secondary colors, which means that we're going to use orange, green, and purple. So we'll see how we're going to do. Okay, let's get started. This is going to be day one. This is the first day of our secondary colors week. It seems like a little too specific of a theme, but let me give you an explanation, a very short explanation, and I think it's going to make sense. I have used a palette for many, many years now that I think actively avoids secondary colors. You know, if I could run through my palette and through what I consider to be my basic palette that I've had over the past 20 years, maybe, it would go something like this. Now, it is true that I've been simplifying my palette, but I think I landed on this palette a long time ago, and I've decided to keep it because it's not so much I feel complacent with it, but there's a sense of comfort in it. I think it's a choice. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. I think it's ultimately a personal choice, but it's almost like wanting to go through life, meeting new people every single day, amassing this huge number of friendships that you collect in the journey that you call your life. So maybe, you have a personality that in your life you would want thousands of friends. You want to have that ability to connect with thousands of people. Or maybe if you're like me, you just have a handful of really good friends that you've kept along the way, and you almost already know it. Those are going to be your friends for life. It doesn't mean that you're not going to meet other people. It doesn't mean that you can't have relationships with other people. But the people that you really hold dear, that you can call friends, are just a handful of people. They don't have to be in the tens or in the dozens or in the hundreds. No. They just have to be really close to you and know you, and you feel comfortable with them. So I think that that's my palette philosophy. I think that I landed on some colors that I feel are fantastic. I don't really feel restricted by them. I don't really feel that they are forcing me into doing a painting that I don't want to do. No, if anything, I feel like they are boundless. I feel like I've barely explored the possibilities that are within the relationships that I can create within the colors that I have. So my palette, my regular palette, and I've said it before, and for those of you who know me, you already know this palette, but what I would consider my palette, my base palette, is titanium white, yellow ochre, cad red, alizarin, ultramarine blue, and raw umber. That's about it. Super, super simple palette. For a yellow hue, it has an earth yellow. For the red hue, it has two reds, one highly saturated, which is the accent of chroma in my palette, which is cad red. It also happens to be very, very warm, and a very cool transparent red. I actually really like the two differences, the two, enormous differences between those two red hues. For my blue, I use what I call my workhorse blue, ultramarine blue. It's a blue violet. It's a very stern blue violet. And raw umber, a very basic neutral umber. You could actually find different versions of raw umber. There are redder ones, which are warmer. There are blacker ones, which are more neutral. And there are greener ones. I actually tend to the more neutral type of raw umber. I really, really like it. I think that for me, that's my perfect neutral earth tone, like naturally neutral earth tone. So that's the palette that I've chosen for my life. Yeah, I'm sure that things can change, but I just feel like those colors are the colors that I want to keep close to me, that I want to know about. And over the past years, I've constructed this bond, this very tight bond with these colors. I know how they behave. They can still surprise me in wonderful ways, but I do feel that I can control, or better yet, that I can steer this ship. I can tell it where to go. I might head into stormy weather and there are going to be difficult days, but I know my palette. I know my palette by heart. Whenever I mention these colors, and right now, as I was listing these colors to you, I close my eyes and I know those colors. I know them by heart. So I really like that about the ability to just spend years and years and years with colors and actually see them as these entities that have personalities and that behave in very specific ways, and you just have to work with them. It's not about you imposing your will onto them. You just have to work with them. These are your friends that are going to help you figure things out through painting. So that's my palette. That's been my palette for years. Now, if you noticed something, my palette is basically constructed on primary colors. I have a yellow, 2 reds, and a blue. And I have a neutral umber added to that, and obviously titanium white. So what I've been actively avoiding are colors that I find redundant. And the reason I find them redundant is because I always tell myself, why would I need an orange if I can mix it? If I could take my yellow and mix it with red. Whenever I want, and you guys have probably seen me put this color in my palette, but whenever I want saturation in my yellow hue, I introduce bismuth yellow. It's like a cadmium lemony yellow that has a lot of body. It's actually opaque. So I love it. The Winsor Newton bismuth yellow to me is a great, great color. But I always tell myself, if I need an orange, I always think of myself as being lazy if I don't just mix, whatever yellow, be it, bismuth yellow or yellow ochre, and mix it with either cad red or alizarin. The option to do orange, to mix orange, is right there. And the same thing goes for green. I can mix my bismuth yellow or yellow ochre with ultramarine blue, and the same thing goes for purple. I can mix my ultramarine with my cad red or my ultramarine with alizarin and get purple hues. Now, is that the same as having a natural orange pigment or a natural green pigment or a natural purple pigment? Would that be the same as having, let's say, a cadmium orange, a viridian, and a dioxazine purple or a cobalt violet? No, it's not. When you can have those hues as pure hues, pure in the sense that you're not mixing a couple of pigments to try to get to those hues, then those colors are for sure going to be more saturated. They're going to provide you with cleaner mixes. So you are going to be able to achieve brighter, more saturated mixes if you start from pure pigments instead of pre-mixed ones. So if your painting is about having the availability of the brightest and most saturated hues that you can in your palette, then yeah, put some cad orange, put some cadmium green pale or some viridian, put some cobalt violet, some dioxazine purple, and now you have the ability to complement your beautiful primary colors with, beautiful secondary colors. That is totally fine. The thing is, that's not quite the painter that I am. I've chosen to minimize the variables with which I paint. So the design of my palette, the philosophy behind my palette, and this is very important because every single palette has a personality. Once you decide to put all these colors together, this is like a recipe, and you have to understand what is behind your palette. What are you trying to convey behind the choices that you made when you pick those colors to make up your palette? So there is a very strong philosophy in my palette. The fact that I choose yellow ochre as my yellow hue above any other yellow that I could pick, above lemon yellow or Windsor yellow or cadmium yellow or Indian yellow, it doesn't matter. I chose an ochre, a yellow earth, and that says something about the direction that I want with my palette. You can say the same thing for my reds, and you can say the same thing for my blue. So every time you put a color down in your palette, ask yourself, what do I want to gain with this color? What's the reason for me introducing this color into my palette? And more importantly, and we've spoken about this time and time again, how does that color relate to every other color that you have in your palette? What are the relationships that that single color is going to generate with every other color that's in your palette? And that way you start recognizing roles within your palette. I'm not saying that you're pre-imposing a role onto your color. I'm not saying that you put this really nice cobalt green in your palette just because you're going to paint grass. So instead of that color being a color that's open for possibilities, you put it in your palette just because you're going to paint grass. It's not really about the equivalency of a color with a specific subject matter. I think that that's a very reductive way of understanding color. So always try to ask yourself, why did I make these choices? What's the philosophy behind the pigments that I chose to make up my palette? Because it is relevant. It is through those pigments that you're going to make painted decisions. This is actually one of the most fundamental questions that you have to ask yourself when you begin to paint. So My avoidance of secondary colors has always been simple. Like I said, I always told myself, I don't really need that color. And if I don't feel the need for a color, if I don't feel like it is absolutely essential to my palette, then I won't put it down. I have to feel that every single color that is there has a reason to be there. And if I take one of those colors out, the integrity of that palette starts to be damaged in a way. Does that mean that if I take one of my reds out, let's say I take alizarin out, that then I can't paint? Not really. I'd like to believe that I can always paint. If people gave me 3 random colors and told me, okay, paint, I'd like to believe that I would be able to paint. I don't think that painting, the ability to paint, is going to be hindered by, let's call them like self-imposed restrictions. But I do think that when we are constructing an ideal palette, it is really important for us to know that every part of that palette is essential to the well-being of that palette. So having said that, what I wanted to do for this week is to say, okay, so if we strip everything down, if we take all of the other colors out and stick to my 3 secondary colors, an orange hue, a green hue, and a purple hue, plus titanium white, obviously, so it's going to be a 4-color palette. But if I stick to those, how is my painting going to be affected? I want to paint throughout this week with the colors that I've chosen to neglect, throughout the years. I want to see what happens to my painting, how it feels, if it feels familiar in a way. And I want to see if by the end of the week, I would be tempted to say, I want from now on an orange in my palette. I want to bring a cad orange in my palette. Or I want to bring a cad green or an olive green or a viridian. Or I want to bring a dioxazine purple, or I want to bring a cobalt violet. A lot of those expensive. So, hopefully not. But I want to see what happens to my painting. So these are the ground rules that I'm going to establish for myself for this week. I'm not going to buy colors. I'm not going to go out and buy a cat orange, which, by the way, we're in quarantine, so I can't really go out and buy an orange or a green or a purple. So, I have to work with what I have. And I have to choose a yellow, a red, and a blue. I have to choose primary colors from which I'm going to mix my secondary colors. And this is going to be a little weird, because I could have said I'm going to pick from my basic palette, so I have to work with yellow ochre, alizarin crimson, and ultramarine blue. Those would have been the possibilities that grow from my very basic palette. But what I'm trying to do is actually give myself like a little bit more range just to explore the possibilities in saturation. Let's put a question mark, after saturation, because the orange, the green, and the purple that I'm going to mix, those hues are not going to be pure. So the saturation in them is not going to be super, super high. So what I'm going to use is a Maimeri. I don't think I bought this one. I think Danny bought this one, but let's call it borrow. I borrowed it from her. So it's a cadmium yellow deep, which honestly doesn't look like a cadmium yellow deep. I mean, it does kind of feel like a yellow orange, but a cad yellow deep should be very, very orange. This is, if anything, like a cad yellow. I really, really do think this is like cad yellow at best. Again, you kind of feel the orange hue in it, but not really. So we're going to pick the Maimeri Classico cad yellow deep. For our red, this is a weird one, I'm going to bring back from the dead my quinacridone magenta, which I used for, what was it, like a week? For those of you who know me, I don't know how many times we used it, but I bought it last year and I wanted to use it. And as soon as I used it, I was like, okay, I don't know if this is a color for me. I saw so many people using it and I jumped on the bandwagon and I feel like an idiot. And I bought it and, it's not a crazy expensive color, but I bought it and I was like, yeah, we're going to make some cool ass paintings with this magenta. And as soon as I put it down, I was like, oh, no, I'm not a magenta person. I'm not a quinacridone person. I don't even like the name, by the way. But it made me miss my alizarin crimson, my real alizarin crimson. I'm not like a permanent alizarin crimson guy either. I love regular alizarin crimson, the type that you put in the sun and it just disappears. I love that. I love that about alizarin crimson. It's like a glass cannon. I don't know if you know that term from video games, but that's what alizarin crimson is. So we're using Maimeri Classico Cadmium Yellow Deep. We're using Winsor Newton quinacridone magenta, and we're going to use our trusted M-gram ultramarine blue. So those are going to be our primary colors for the week. Cadmium yellow deep, quinacridone magenta, and ultramarine blue. So we have a mix of semi-transparent colors with, saturation. Some of them are a little less saturated. And I think it's going to give us a nice range. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to try, I'm not making any promises, but I'm going to try to mix the same orange hue, the same green hue, and the same purple hue. If I feel I have to adjust something, I'll try to mention it every day, but I'll try to make them look similar so that our palette doesn't really change. Now, the reason that I want it to be constant is that I want to have the same-ish experience every single day. Now, if I want to really learn about these hues, I have to try and maintain as much consistency as I can. So my orange is going to be pre-mixed from my cadmium yellow deep and my quinacridone magenta being far more covering and far more saturated than that cad yellow deep. Probably because the cad yellow is actually a little bit cheaper than the quinacridone. My green is going to be cad yellow deep and ultramarine blue. And my purple is going to be, I think, a lot more quinacridone than ultramarine blue. So I want to have it lean towards, the magenta side a little bit. I want to feel some of that red in there. So the cool thing about pre-mixing these colors is that I'm actually going to be able to feel the two colors that are within this mix. And this is actually a very cool thing about pre-mixing colors with colors that you already kind of know how they behave. Even though, again, cad yellow deep and quinacridone magenta, they don't really form part of my traditional palette. I'm not surprised by them. Like, I can understand them. I can recognize their qualities and I can understand the makeup of that color. So it's not going to be terribly foreign to me. But like I was saying, it's almost like a recipe where you can taste everything that you put in the pot. You can actually dissect every single flavor and you can tell where everything comes from. I think that that's one of the greatest things about mixing color in a palette, where you can just tell how a single color is affecting a mixture. If you're able to recognize those things, oh my God, you're in the right path towards understanding your colors. So those were my three choices. And I think today's painting was pretty cool. I think the toughest day is the first one, where you are not only trying to recognize all the benefits that, that particular palette can offer to you, but you're trying to control those things. So you're being introduced to something that, even if I know what to expect, it is something new. So you are at this level of introduction, but you also have to use these colors. You don't really have time to tell yourself, yeah, I'm going to wait for, 10 more paintings to just get acquainted with these colors. No. You actually have to start recognizing their personalities and telling yourself, okay, this is what I can do with you. So I'm guessing that by the end of the week, I'm going to have a better grasp on how each of these hues relate particularly to each other. But for today, as an introduction, I was like, okay, this is going to be my palette. This is what I have access to. This is what I have to accept. Remember, one of the greatest things about using a palette that is just obviously restricted is not yearning for something else. When I'm painting with these colors, my mind can't be in a place where it wants yellow, where it wants red, where it wants blue. No, that mindset would be a disservice to my painting. But here's the tricky part, which is actually really, really awesome. Because I know that I mixed yellow and I mixed magenta to make that orange, for example, I actually can convince myself that I'm going to be able to access some of the yellow that there is in orange, or some of the yellow that there is in the green, or some of the red that there's in the purple, just because I know the colors that I use to mix those hues. So even if it sounds really strange, there is a presence of blueness within, let's say, the purple, or there is a presence of yellowness within the greenness, or there is a presence of redness within the orange, that you're always going to be able to almost like massage into your painting. Are you going to be able to say blue and to say yellow and to say red? Probably not. At least nothing that would compare objectively with a yellow pigment or a red pigment or a blue pigment. You can't really do that. That's why they are primary colors. You can't really access primary colors through other colors. But you can actually give a sense of something being yellower, perhaps, or redder, perhaps, or bluer, perhaps. I'll give you an example. I noticed that if I left, that initial transparent layer, and I'm using liquid as my medium, but if I applied my color thinly on top of this, white-ish paper, the brightness of the paper and the transparency of mixing my purple and my orange actually gives me access to a very deep red. So I was like, okay, there's some redness in there that I can actually access. In the same way, if I mix all those colors together, I have access to a gray. If I mix my purple and my green, and then I add a little bit of orange and a little bit of white, I can have a somewhat, let's call it somewhat, neutral gray. So that was actually really, really nice too. And I noticed that if I mix orange with just a little bit of green and I mix a lot of white into that, I can actually have access to something that's kind of yellow. So again, these are interpretations of those hues. They can't, and let me say this again, they can't compete objectively with pure primary colors, with pure primary pigments. That's never going to happen. But you can be sly enough and you can weasel yourself into trying to control relationships within your palette so that the range of possibilities seems to expand a little bit. It's really, really exciting. I've noticed that exercises like these, exercises where you consciously put restrictions upon yourself, where you tell yourself, I am going to work within the confines of these possibilities that the palette has to offer to me. When you decide to do that, you have to tap into the very basic fundamentals of color mixing. The very, very basic fundamentals. And that to me is painting. Painting can produce an infinite number of results, as varied as there are human beings on this planet that want to solve something through painting. There's a myriad of possibilities that can be achieved through painting. But when you understand that all those possibilities come from a very, very basic foundation, it almost ties everything together. This is not about trickery in painting. This is not about doing things that nobody else can do through painting. This is not about secret recipes. No, this is like common knowledge. The most fascinating thing about painting is that fundamentally we all know how it's done. We all know the rules. And yet the people that are extraordinary are the ones who can take those very few simple rules and bend them and control them in ways that, blow your mind. They explore places and possibilities that we were completely blind to. So whenever I choose to work within these possibilities, I think that it reminds me that some of the most beautiful things about painting, or some of the things that I truly love about painting, are the ones that have to do with how simple it is and how basic it is. So hopefully this week is going to give me a chance to say, okay, this is my rule set. Let me see how much I can push it. And let me see how much I can push it in order to then go back to my palette and feel more confident about everything that can be achieved with my palette. So that's going to be it for today. I hope you guys can paint along and also make discoveries about your palette or challenge some of the things that you thought you knew about these colors. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Remember, tomorrow, Spanish Tuesday, Martes Español. So I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye.